Hello everyone. Today we'll be speaking with Joshua Oppenheimer about his absolutely incredible film, The Act of Killing. Stay tuned. In 1965, the Indonesian government was overthrown by the military. Millions of ethnic Chinese and communists, and people accused of communists who were actually just intellectuals, were executed. Anwar Congo and his friends were part of a military group, a paramilitary group, which actually carried out a lot of these brutal murders. They were what's called gangsters, and they modeled themselves largely after American movies and American movie characters. And they're celebrated to this day. Nobody was brought to The Hague. There was no intervention from the outside world. And in fact, many of their friends and people from that organization are in power in Indonesia. Joshua Oppenheimer went there and documented their attempt to reenact these murders in a movie. They're fledgling filmmakers now, and The Act of Killing really covers that process and attempts to bring to the surface some of their feelings about what they did back then, and really follows a trajectory that's quite fascinating. Joshua has worked for over a decade with militias, death squads, and their victims to explore the relationship between political violence and the public imagination. His award-winning films include The Globalization Tapes, The Entire History of the Louisiana Purchase, These Places We've Learned to Call Home. The Act of Killing has swept festivals around the world, earning over 30 prizes and awards, including the Audience and Jury Prize at Berlin, the 2013 Danish Academy Award, Grand Prize and Audience Award at the Sheffield Doc Festival, Grand Prize at Docs Barcelona, Documenta Madrid, and CPH Docs. The film tops almost every must-see documentary list of the year and is actually executive produced by Werner Herzog and Errol Morris. We are very, very honored to have Joshua in the house today. I'm so excited to talk to you about this film. I mean, it's the kind of film that begs so many questions, and you were asking me, how is it to be a talk show host when you're actually a hardworking filmmaker? And it's like, it's for moments like this that I get to actually sit down with a colleague and dig into the work. Fantastic film.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. How long did you work on the film?
From the moment I met Anwar, which was the main character of the film in 2005, to when we finished shooting was 5 years, and then there was 3 years of editing because there was 1,200 hours of material. So it was a long process, a whole chapter of my life.
Yeah, and you said 3 years editing?
3 years editing, yeah. It was a big process. And before I met Anwar, there was 2 years of filming every perpetrator I could find in Indonesia. And before that, I'd been working with survivors of the 1965-66 genocide, which is really how the project began.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to ask you how you possibly got into that, because it seemed like they all had, it would be interesting, they would break out and call you Josh. Seemed that they were very familiar with you and there was a lot of trust there.
We absolutely became close, and maybe the most important challenge that the film throws to audiences is for audiences to approach Anwar, to approach men who've killed thousands of people through my intimacy with them. So viewers become close to these men through my closeness with them. But it didn't begin that way. The journey didn't begin that way. I began in 2001, 2002 with my collaborator Christine Cynn, working in a community of survivors of the 1965-66 genocide. They were plantation workers living on an oil palm plantation, a Belgian oil palm plantation, about 60 miles from Medan, North Sumatra, where we made The Act of Killing. And we were making a film with them where they were documenting their struggle to organize a union. And they desperately needed a union because the women workers were spraying a herbicide, a weed killer, with no protective clothing, and it was dissolving their livers and killing them in their 40s. And it turned out their biggest obstacle organizing a union was fear, because their parents and grandparents had been in a strong plantation workers union until 1965, had been accused of being communists just because they were in a union, and had been killed, and they were afraid it could happen again. Now, after we made that film, the plantation workers, the survivors, said, come back and let's make another film together as quickly as possible about the source of our, not about why we are afraid. That is to say, not just what happened in 1965, but what it's like to live with the perpetrators still in positions of power all around them. So we came back immediately in early 2003, and first of all, word got out that we were interested in what happened in 1965. And when that happened, the army, which is deployed in every village in Indonesia, started to show up and would no longer let us film with the survivors. We simply were not allowed the survivors were not allowed to tell their stories. And so the survivors said, okay, if we can't be filmed, around us in this village are aging death squad leaders. Perhaps you can film them and they will tell you what happened to our relatives. And that was how I first approached the perpetrators on the survivors' behalf.
Wow. And when you approached, was Anwar one of the first you met?
Not at all.
No.
So what happened was we went to these neighbors, and they were neighbors in this small village. We would ask very general questions like, what did you do for a living? Or tell us about your youths, because we didn't know if it was safe to ask about the genocide. And to our horror and astonishment, every single time these men would answer with boastful, sort of self-glorifying but grisly accounts of mass murder, which they would tell in front of their wives, their children, but even their grandchildren. And this contrast between perpetrators who were boasting and survivors who were forced into silence. The perpetrators are telling things far more incriminating than anything the survivors could possibly have said, made me feel as though I'd wandered into Germany 40 years after the Holocaust, only to find the Nazis still in power. And from that point on, I knew that I would give this as much time as it takes to address. So we showed this very first footage with perpetrators from this small village to those survivors who wanted to see it and to the Indonesian human rights community. Everyone said, Josh, you are onto something terribly important. Continue filming the perpetrators, because you're finding out what happened, but also any Indonesian who sees this will be forced finally to acknowledge the rotten heart of this whole regime. So I filmed every perpetrator I could find, working from plantation to plantation, death squad to death squad, up the chain of command for 2 years before I met Anwar. Anwar was the 41st perpetrator I filmed. All of the perpetrators were boastful. All would take me to the places where they killed, launch into spontaneous demonstrations of how they killed, complain that they hadn't thought to bring along props to use as weapons or friends to play victims with them. And I lingered on Anwar, I think, because somehow his pain was close to the surface. And I intuited that when I met him that perhaps the boasting is not a sign of pride, but the opposite. Perhaps the boasting is a defensive effort to convince themselves that what they did was right, so that they don't have to wake up every morning, look in the mirror, and see a mass murderer.
He had nightmares, has nightmares.
And he opens up about that.
You got so close with him that you were in his bedroom. You were in all their bedrooms. It was really remarkable. Let's go ahead and look at a trailer so we can all sort of get a peek into Josh's experience and his 1,200 hours of footage.
Cuman jangan lama kali nangis ya. Born free as Action. Itu definisi kejahatan perang. Itu buatan orang yang menang. Saya pemenang.
Tolong, Bapak.
Yang saya harapkan tadi tidak sampai begitu kali.
Nggak bisa diulangi.
Beratap.
Banyak ya, Bios, manusia yang terasa begini tuh ya. Apa dosa sama saya?
You're going through villages, you're filming these perpetrators one after the other. You get to Anwar and does he tell you that he's wanting to make a film? How did the film within the film happen?
It actually began in a way before I met Anwar, because after filming, Anwar was the 41st perpetrator I filmed, but after filming 10 perpetrators, all of whom would take me to the places they killed and then launch into these spontaneous demonstrations, sort of simple reenactments, I could see that I wasn't exactly getting testimony. You know, I wasn't getting the kind of sober testimony you expect of perpetrators of crimes against humanity that we are used to seeing in documentaries. I was getting something much closer to performance, and performance is always intended for an audience. And the question is, who is their imagined audience? And to answer that question, I recognized that if I could answer that question, we could understand maybe the whole system of impunity and corruption that's in place here. So I started to propose to the perpetrators long before I met Anwar. I would say exactly this: look, you've participated in one of the biggest killings in human history. Your whole society's built on it. Your life has been shaped by it. I want to know what it means to you and to your families and to your society. You want to show me what you've done. So go ahead and show me what you've done in whatever way you wish. I will film your reenactments, but I will also film the process of making those reenactments. I'll film you and your fellow Death Squad veterans discussing what you should show, what you should not show, why you want to show what you want to show, why you want to leave some things out, and thereby answer these questions. What does this mean to you? What does this mean to your society? How do you want to be seen? How do you see yourself? In that sense, the method was not a trick to get them to open up, nor was it something they were doing before I met them. And nor is there a separate film that they're making apart from the act of killing. They're only making scenes for the act of killing. Now, when I met Anwar, I certainly didn't think of filming all of those men as a kind of casting process. I also didn't expect to have these surreal, genre-inspired, complicated dramatizations. What I expected was these simple reenactments. But Anwar's, because his pain was close to the surface, I wondered if I show him back the first reenactment on the roof, where he takes me to a rooftop and shows how he killed with wire. And after he shows, he says that he has to forget his nightmares, to forget the trauma of what he's been through. He's been drinking, taking drugs, and going out dancing, and he starts to dance where he's killed hundreds of people. To understand, to see if he would recognize the pain, the moral meaning, the real meaning of what he's done in the footage, I screened that back to him.
If he would even realize the impact that it's having on him in the present day.
Exactly.
Because he's in complete denial.
Exactly. Exactly.
Before we get into how he reacted, we actually have that clip here. Let's look at Anwar on the roof showing Joshua how he killed with wire.
Mungkin ya banyak hantunya, karena di sini tuh banyak manusia yang dihabisi,
yang mati nggak wajar lah sih.
Yang mati yang tidak wajar. Datang sini sehat, sampai di sini dipukul mati. Kalau dulu kita main pukul, pertama itu datang kita main pukul, itu kan darah banyak. Di sini kan darah, di sini kan darah banyak ini kan. Jadi karena kelewat banyak darah itu kan bersihnya kan bau, ya kan. Jadi cara untuk jangan keluar darah itu inilah pakai sistem ini, ya. Saya peragakan boleh kan? Boleh. Boleh ya. Ya, itu duduk aja sini lah. mereng lah sana.
Ini.
Perasaannya yang mesti diperagakan. Beginilah caranya supaya jangan darah itu terlalu banyak, tahu kan? Jadi saya menghilangkan itu, saya usahakan dengan musik enak, saya bisa nari, iya kan? Bisa happy, sedikit alkohol, ya kan? Sedikit marijuana, sedikit inex, ekstasi, sudah siap minum fly, kita pun happy tuh. Caca. Aneh ya. Ta 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 kita tidak ta di ta ta cara ririndap ta ti ti ta hehe ha
Jorge,
Unbelievable. Now, was it any, before we talk about him watching it back, was it any struggle to get him to take you to the site of that? Was he proud as punch to show you everything?
I think he's not really proud. I think that none of them are proud. I think they're trying to act proud. They're trying to convince themselves that they're proud. But that was the very first day I met him. I went to his house. He was notorious. He was sort of famous. So I went to his house with a camera ready because I wanted to make sure I filmed. I wanted to make sure I got him on film and got what he did. And I arrive at his house, and his wife has guests, and he was happy to be filmed straight away, but he said, why don't I, instead of filming here because there's guests, why don't I take you to the place where a lot of these things happened, and we can talk about it there, and I can actually show you in more detail what happened.
So that's like one of the first moments you filmed.
It's one of my first moments with him, because in fact we didn't drive in the same car to that place. So going up those stairs, I'd spent half an hour with the man before that.
Wow.
And that is extraordinary, except that it was also somehow typical in that of the 40 men I'd filmed before him. Now, after this moment where he dances on the roof, I wanted to know if he would see the meaning of what he's doing there in the mirror of the footage. So I screen it back to him. And when I screen it back to him, he looks very disturbed. But he does not dare somehow say, this is awful, this is disturbing, because to say that would be to admit that it was wrong. And he's never been forced to admit it was wrong because he's remained in power ever since. And he doesn't even say, this makes me look bad, because for the same reason, to say this makes me look bad, given that it's true, would also be to admit it was wrong. So instead, he looks very disturbed, and he takes that emotion that he's feeling, I think, and displaces it onto his hair. He says, I need to dye my hair black. His clothes, he says he looks like he's dressed for a picnic, his acting. And so began a kind of 5-year process of him trying to fix whatever scene he'd shot before by embellishing it in some surreal way, inspired by his favorite Hollywood movies. Now, each time I think what he's in fact trying to do by quote unquote fixing the scene is denying what's wrong, denying what's really wrong with the scene. What's really wrong with the previous scene he shot was that he did these awful things, and it haunts him, and it's terrible, and he knows it. Right. But instead of admitting that, he proposes these surreal and superficial fixes. Now the method remained the same. From that point on, we would shoot one scene, he would watch it, respond to it emotionally, and propose the next scene. Each time, I think, trying to run away from the moral meaning of the previous scene, each time trying to run away from his pain. And it would get more and more surreal, more and more complicated, and more close to the Hollywood films that he loved. Now, when I reached, as I said earlier, I started in the countryside, but when I reached the city, it turned out the army had recruited its killers from the ranks of what were called movie theater gangsters. These were real gangsters, proper gangsters, involved with very serious organized crime, prostitution rings, drugs, people's trafficking, illegal logging, smuggling, and so on, protection rackets. But they were hanging out in movie theaters. They loved American movies. As a side business, they were scalping tickets. And the Indonesian left and not just the left, there was a broad-based boycott of American films in 1965 because the head of the American Motion Picture Association in Indonesia, the importer of American films to Indonesia, had been exposed in the media as being a CIA agent involved with a plot to overthrow the president. So people in Indonesia boycotted American movies, and that was threatening to Anwar and his friends' income as movie theater gangsters, and they felt offended because they loved all these stars. Elvis Presley was one of Anwar's idols, so it was like an offense to these screen idols whom they loved. And so the movie theater gangsters, the army recruited its death squads when in the city of Medan from the ranks of these movie theater gangsters, and each death squad was operating out of a different cinema. And Anwar's was the most powerful, the most notorious, operating out of the best and most glamorous cinema in Medan. Now, so as Anwar started to propose these embellishments to run away from the pain of that he felt shooting whatever we shot previously, he started to propose that the scenes should resemble the Hollywood films that he loved, and that's how the method evolved to where it goes in the film.
So when I see a scene of one of his death squad partners, the big fat guy, what's his name?
Well, Herman is a protege in this 3 million strong paramilitary movement.
Oh,
he wasn't
okay.
killing
He wasn't
at the
actually a
time. He was
killer.
too young.
Oh,
But
okay.
he's a criminal and thug who
He's
was
a super criminal. Yeah. He was running for office at one point.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Amazing. He says, when he's running for office, he says, if I win, I'll be able to get money from everybody.
There's a wonderful
Because
moment.
I'll be able to claim their buildings are too small or too big or whatever I need to do, and they'll all have to pay me.
He said he'd get on the board of the government that does zoning.
Yeah.
And he would go and tell people that they violated zoning laws and then threaten to knock down their buildings unless they pay him back.
I mean, this
pay
may
him
be the
money.
stuff that people think about, right? Like corrupt people think about. They never say it, you know?
It's what they do, but they don't say
Yeah,
it.
they don't talk about it. And then you watch him campaigning and shaking everybody's hands, and you're thinking, please don't vote for him. You know? But I was just going to say that basically, like, when they're looking at how to do this, he's looking at photos, right? And he's planning his outfits, and he's recommending what's best to kill in.
That's right.
Because that's really, if you think about it, the only accomplishment.
And it's
of
an
his
interesting
life,
moment
right?
in the film because there's a moment where Anwar's showing these old photos of himself. It doesn't come near the beginning of the film, but it's the only time we see an image from that time in the film. The Act of Killing is a film without art, even though it's dealing with events in 1965. It's just definitively a film about today. And so I don't use archive footage like Claude Lanzmann's Shoah. He also doesn't use archive footage. And people have said that's given many reasons for that. But I think the most powerful reason for Shoah not using archive footage is that actually the now of the film is the time where he's shooting, where he's witnessing people go through in the early 80s and going through trauma as they remember what they did. And so just as in Shoah, the lack of archive keeps the film in the present, here too it does. And the one time we see these old images or these photos of Anwar, and I love this, ironically, the only reason we're seeing these photos is not so we get a glimpse into the past, although that's the effect on the viewer, but he's just trying to show what kind of clothes he should wear for one as he embellishes the next reenactment.
So that's a distinct choice that you made. Was Shoah an influence?
Shoah is a key influence for how cinema can address trauma in the present.
Okay. Let's look at the scene where Anwar is looking at old photos.
Ini saya, ini Anwar Punggung.
Pak Anwar sendiri tuh.
Ini sedang gulung letek ini. Sedang bergelek. Ini saya, ini baju kotak, celana loreng, ini sepatu belang ini sebetulnya. Kita lihat elitnya ya kan.
Jadi Pak Anwar, saya lebih simpati dengan Bapak pakaian seperti ini ya untuk studio.
Iya. Kalau untuk
Dengan di pembantaian istilahnya ya Pak.
itu jin jaga.
Jin seperti ini ya Pak ya. Jin ya.
Pembantaian itu celana jenisnya jenis tebal seperti
ya.
Seperti ini.
Ya, tapi ada corak-corak ke peta-peta gitu ya Pak ya.
Iya, boleh juga.
Kecil ya? Kotak kecil gitu ya.
Kotak-kotak kecil. Karena aku tetap mengelihat macam mana cara-cara orang film. Cuman yang tidak aku ikutin pakai cara berpakaian
He
Elvis
loved
Presley.
Elvis, but he didn't copy Elvis. So when I see Erman going around to shop owners and saying, "I need money, I need more money, put more money in there," and it seems, are they Chinese, the store owners? Yeah, and so they're terrified. And that one man who keeps putting money in the envelope seems old enough to remember what happened, probably. Is he trying to get a budget for the film they're making?
No, no. On the contrary, the gangsters talk about, Anwar and his friends talk about how at the time of the killing, they would kill anybody accused of being a communist, but the ethnic Chinese were kind of tended to be traders, and some of them had a little more money than, for example, a palm oil plantation worker who would have nothing. And so they would use those people for money. They would extort them, and those people had to buy their lives. And when they stopped paying, they would be killed. And Anwar tells this story, and then the next thing we see in the film is we see two thugs, Herman and Safit, going around a marketplace collecting money from Chinese shopkeepers, showing that essentially this extortion has never ended, and the terror lives on, and if these men don't pay, they get beaten up. We hear them being threatened with being beaten up. They're not paying for the film, and on the contrary, it was an expense for the film. Let me explain. I'm not a filmmaker who will stop at nothing to get what I want. The film looks like it goes to places I think that you rarely see in documentary, and that of course takes determination and some ambition, but it doesn't necessitate committing crimes and being evil and hurting people. When Herman and Safit, the two thugs who go around collecting money, said they wanted to do this, they proposed it as a day in the life. They do this every day. Do you want to film me? My crew said, Josh, you must, my Indonesian crew said, you must film this because this happens in every market in Indonesia and it's every day and it's never filmed. And I had to think very hard, how can I do this without becoming an accessory to the crime? I didn't want my cameras and my presence to make the Chinese shopkeepers more afraid. Now suddenly these men who visit them every week asking for money have their own TV crew. They have so much power, they can do this on TV. I really didn't want that to happen. So what I decided to do, but I also knew I had to film it. So what I decided to do was to tell Herman and Safit to move along 50 yards or so after they collected the money and wait for me. And I said I would get a release form signed because that would necessitate a conversation. But what I was really doing was paying everybody back and explaining why we were there. And for that shoot, they extorted 30 people that day, and we spent 1,500 euros that day. So they were taking about 50 euros per shop. That's a significant amount of money for a market stall. And 1,500 euros shooting a day in the life was a significant amount of money for us too. But I felt it was really important because I didn't want those shopkeepers to
think that you were complicit, or to think that the cameras somehow were lending some kind of power or authority to the thugs.
And a new level of impunity to them, that they could do this on
Incredible.
camera.
Very smart move. I was thinking you would say that was a hidden camera, you know, something like that, but you actually went back and made right. I wish you were there every day for those people.
I would be bankrupt very quickly.
Speaking of which, these people saw scenes as you filmed it. They also ostensibly saw the entire film at the end.
Yeah.
Do you expect, what was the reaction, and do you expect any sort of positive change or swing towards making things right in Indonesia?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Anwar saw, when he saw the finished film, it was just over a year ago. He was quite emotional. I think you can't be the main character of this film without being moved, without being emotional. He saw the film and was tearful. He was crying. He was silent for a long time. Eventually, he went to the bathroom and pulled himself together and came back and spoke. And he said, Josh, this film shows what it is like to be me. And I'm relieved. The other thing he said, I'm relieved to have finally been able to show what this means. I've been talking about it my whole life, but I never talk about what it means. no one ever wants to hear what it means. And Anwar and I remain in touch every 3 to 4 weeks. And in some ways, I think we may always remain in touch, maybe not that often, but we may always remain in touch because we've been through a very long, very intimate, very painful journey together that has changed us both in ways that it will take a long time to fully understand. The most wonderful part of releasing The Act of Killing has been the effect that it's had in Indonesia. Our whole strategy has been to avoid the film being banned in Indonesia, because if the film is banned, it becomes a crime to watch the film at all. And if it's a crime to watch the film, that's an excuse for the paramilitary groups, the army, hired thugs in Indonesia to physically attack screenings. That, of course, would make people afraid to watch the film, and it would be dangerous to watch the film. So we knew that to release the film, we had to screen, before we could screen it widely, we had to build up very high-level political and cultural support for The Act of Killing. So all last autumn, we held screenings for Indonesia's leading filmmakers, celebrities, artists, intellectuals, human rights advocates, survivors at the National Human Rights Commission in Jakarta. All those people said everyone in Indonesia needs to see this film right away. They took the film back to their communities and held screenings by invitation, because an invitation-only screening doesn't have to pass the censors. They did that on the 10th of December last year. That was International Human Rights Day. We started with 50 screenings in 30 cities. But even though they were by invitation, the average screening size was about 200 people each. So a lot of people saw it right on the first day. It grew wider from there. As of the summer, we reached 1,100 screenings in 118 cities. And the film became available, we made the film available for free download for anyone in Indonesia on the 30th of September this year. That was the anniversary of the start of the atrocities. In the first day, there were 6,500 downloads, so it was a much higher uptake than we expected. And the film has, above all, the impact in the media has been astonishing, and it's meant that when we had these, by the time the summer rolled around, almost all the screenings were public and the film still wasn't being banned. The media has basically broken a 47-year silence on the genocide, reporting on the genocide as a crime against humanity for the first time. The editor of Tempo magazine, the largest news publication in Indonesia, called me after watching the film a year ago and said, "Josh, there was a time before the act of killing, now there's a time after the act of killing. He said, I have been censoring stories about the genocide ever since I took this job. I won't do it anymore because I don't want to grow old as a perpetrator." And his magazine came out with a special double edition of the magazine, packed with 75 pages of boastful testimony from perpetrators gathered by a team of 60 journalists from all over the country, plus 25 pages about the movie. It sold out immediately. They reprinted it. It sold out again. They reprinted it. It sold out again because Indonesians were astonished that this Holocaust that everybody knew had happened was suddenly filling the pages of the most important news publication after never appearing in the media before. The film has come to Indonesia like the child in the emperor's new clothes, just as the survivors and the human rights community wished it would when they first said, "Film the perpetrators." Wow. It has opened a space for Indonesians to talk about the need for justice, the need for a fight against impunity, the relationship between genocide and terror and corruption and thuggery. For the first time,
the government there?
Without fear.
I mean, that's incredible, and congratulations, and that's a dream that every doc filmmaker holds, I think, when they go into a situation, especially something like that. You look at Kirby Dick and what he's managed to pull off in the American military with rape. We look at the few films that really have a huge, massive impact outside of the cinema, off the screen, and bring real physical world action. And so, congratulations, and thank God you've managed to pull that off. But what is going to happen now? You just mentioned 65 pages or some odd of perpetrator testimony. What about the actual victims?
Well,
what voice do they have? Because with those people in power, I think it's quite, if you take a Holocaust survivor and you say, don't worry, let's begin to get you better, you should express yourself. That's one thing, but if the people who did the killing are in power, how can you reasonably say to someone who's Chinese or maybe left-leaning to go ahead and talk about it?
Well, all of the perpetrators' testimony, I mean, what the editor of Tempo magazine said when they published this 75 pages of perpetrators boasting was they said, we want to show that your film, we're doing this to support your movie by showing that it could have been made anywhere in Indonesia, that the problems it underscores are systemic, that there's 10,000 Anwars around the country. That has opened a space for survivors in the human rights community to demand a truth commission, a reconciliation process, a national apology, and justice on the basis of those first three things.
Justice.
It's opened a space for them to be able to demand that without fear. Now, to change the enormous problems that you see in the film requires a huge people's movement. And something bigger, I think, than what overthrew Suharto in 1998. That was a people's moment, but we need actually a people's movement because, for example, next year is a presidential election. In the presidential election in Indonesia, the most likely candidate is a guy named Prabowo. Prabowo is the very first foreigner to be on a State Department blacklist for committing mass murder and torture. He's not allowed to come into the country. Now, it's ironic, given that the United States pretty much supported all of the crimes that he's accused of having committed. But if he wins, no doubt he will be offered a state visit, allowed to come to the country. But Prabowo is basically, there's enormous change that needs to happen. The next president is likely to be a war criminal. We have right now in Jakarta, there's the largest labor protests in recent memory in Indonesia. People from sweatshop workers striking for better conditions. Pancasila Youth, the paramilitary group in the act of killing, is there on the front lines, paid by the sweatshops to hack at the protesters with machetes. So there's a lot that needs to be fought for. A film can't change a whole country. What a film can do is open a space for people to talk about the problems.
Oh, well, yes, I'm not putting it all on you. I think you've done a fantastic job. I'd like to, you mentioned a couple things that beg for clips. One is how is the winner, who's the winner and how does the winner get to define history? Let's look at that.
Bukan maksud saya membuat keadaan tidak nyaman, tapi saya ingin kembali ke pernyataan Bapak. Dengan alasan perang, Bapak tidak dihantui seperti Anwar, tapi Konvensi Jenewa tetap menganggap yang Bapak lakukan sebagai kejahatan perang.
Belum tentu kita sependapat sama pengadilan internasional itu seperti yang saya katakan tadi. Bush waktu kuasa, Guantanamo benar. Saddam Hussein bikin pembunuh massal, senjata pemusnah massal. Itu kebenarannya Bush. Kebenaran itu ternyata tidak benar. Jadi bisa jadi itu Konvensi Jenewa juga kebenaran waktu sekarang Konvensi Jenewa. Besok ada Konvensi Jakarta. Itu Jenewa punya kita buang. Itu definisi kejahatan perang. Itu buatan orang yang menang. Saya pemenang, saya mesti bikin juga definisi kejahatan perang.
So when they're talking about, Bush and Guantanamo and making that comparison, and you just mentioned, what's his name? Prabowo. And that most of his actions were supported by the U.S. Are you suggesting that the U.S. actually backed the 1965 massacre of the communists?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was during the Cold War. It was seen as it was a time when any good communist is a dead communist. And in the eyes of U.S. policymakers, the U.S. provided weapons, money, training, radios so that the army could coordinate the killings. And I interviewed a retired State Department official and a retired deputy station chief of the CIA's Jakarta station, both of whom talk about how the U.S. how they provided death lists. They collected lists of thousands of names of journalists, trade unionists, prominent leftists, intellectuals, collected these names and gave them to the army. And when you asked them about what they were doing, and said, kill these people. And when you asked them what they were doing, they boastfully talked about it as though they were providing crucial intelligence, as though they were kind of spies. And they probably were spies. They were in the intelligence service, but they talked about it as though they were providing kind of crucial intelligence to help the army go after the really bad guys. But in fact, everyone on those lists were public figures. The army would know. I mentioned earlier that the army's deployed down to every village. So the army would know if in this neighborhood or this village there's a prominent left-wing writer, a prominent progressive teacher. They would know. It wasn't useful intelligence. It was an unmistakable signal to the new military dictatorship that we want you to kill everybody, kill all of these people, and we will reward you with aid. And that was what happened. And immediately after the killings, there was a conference in Geneva where all of the major, organized by the CEO of Time magazine, Time Life, it was a conference in Geneva where all these big American companies, mining companies, oil companies, forestry companies, Coca-Cola, they all got together and they divided the Indonesian economy like pieces of a pie. They would have little focus group meetings where they would talk about what laws they wanted in each sector so that they could freely invest and profit off of the new opening of this country that's just been through a US-sponsored genocide. So I think we have to remember when we ask, what can the West do about this? We have to. I ask Adi in the clip we just watched, I say, what if you were brought to The Hague? And he says, bring me to The Hague, I'll become famous. But there's a line that's not in the film right after that where he says to me, Josh, come on, you know I won't be brought to The Hague. It's not in the West's interest for me to be brought to The Hague. And so we have to remember, and he's absolutely right, we have to remember when we ask what can the West do, that the 1965 genocide, the 32 years of military dictatorship, which involved also the invasion of East Timor and the killing of 1/3 of the population there, the ongoing use of gangsters in politics, the enormous corruption. This is the West's vision for Indonesia. And not just Indonesia, but so many other countries across the global south that produce everything we buy. I'm wearing a t-shirt now from H&M that I picked up for something like $6. And when I was clipping off the tag, I noticed it said made in Bangladesh. And just like those oil palm plantation workers, those women who were spraying weed killer for a Belgian company and dying as they to make oil palm for skin cream and margarine, the workers who made this may be buried in a pile of rubble because the H&M factory collapsed last summer, killing virtually everyone in it, and did so because the building was unsafe, the conditions were unsafe, there was no union because the workers were both desperately poor and also too oppressed for them to be able to organize a union. So we have to remember that the reality we see in the act of killing is not some freak aberration on the other side of the world. It is the underbelly of the reality right here.
It's how we live.
It's how we live.
It enables our perceived wealth and plenty, abundance, and our abundance.
And it's a metaphor.
It's indentured servitude on a global level.
Exactly.
And it was, I mean, we owe a great apology to all of those victims' families, you know, in reality. I'm really, I'm glad that you stated all of that, and we'll make sure that everybody sees that clip. I want to look at sort of Anwar's friend who comes to town, who I don't know what Anwar told him necessarily about what he was getting into, but he was sort of the first one. It's Adi. He was the first one who said, "What are you doing? What are we doing here? Maybe we shouldn't let this out, right?" So let's look at Cruelty and the image.
Cuma ini, kalau saya melihat ya, kalau sukses kita bikin ini film, menyatakan bahwa film GTKPLS PKI yang lulu, PKI kejam, tidak kejam. Yang kejam tuh kita.
Kita yang kejam.
Kalau sukses, ini
makanya
belum.
aku
Ini yang perlu disadari, sebab kita segala langkah kita harus kita sadar. Harus kita sadari. Ini bukan masalah kesangsian. 40 tahun juga sudah apa namanya, daluarsa ya. Sudah tidak ada. Tapi bukan masalah itu. Masalah image. Di dalam hati masyarakat. Ah, gak benar, kan betul itu dugaanku dulu. Gak mungkin PKI gitu. Ternyatanya mereka lebih
sadis, lebih kejam.
Bukan untuk kita. Tapi untuk satu sejarah. Penilaian satu sejarah berbalik. Bukan 180, 360 derajat itu berbalik. Kalau sukses kita memerankan ini.
Tapi mengapa mesti sejarah itu disimpan-simpan? Orang belum kenyataan memang begitu. Itu memang yang diminta.
Bukan. Hasilnya keyakinan Anwar, keyakinan saya selama ini tidak benar. Bukan PKI yang kejam.
Iya, memang itu ya apa?
Saya sendiri sependapat, kan saya udah bilang. Tapi tidak semua kejujuran yang dapat menjadi konsumsi publik. Saya percaya Tuhan pun juga punya rahasia. Kita sadar sekali, kita kejam. Oke.
Jadi udah ada statement.
Nah, jadinya itu yang perlu ku informasikan Mawar. Macam mana menelannya, mencernanya, silakan.
Okay. So, I didn't understand from when I was watching the film that was it. That was his sayonara on the process. He wasn't going to go down, be part of bringing this to the surface anymore. What was that like for you? I mean, this is a huge breakthrough moment, right? Somebody coming in and saying, hey, wait a second.
This was I mean, this whole section, this whole journey with Adi coming into the film was amazing because he comes in from Jakarta. He wasn't just a member of Anwar's death squad. They were friends together since childhood. They were doing crime together as children, stealing bikes and so on. He comes in and there's obviously a pain, a nervousness in Adi. They hug on the tarmac of the airport when he gets off the flight. He comes off a flight wearing a t-shirt that says apathetic. And it was just astonishing. This is the first time I see this man. He looks a little, Anwar first says to him, you never return my calls. And then they're together and Adi says, all these things that I've been dying for somebody to say. The killings were wrong, the government should apologize, there should be a truth and reconciliation process. All the propaganda justifying this has been a lie. And he's like a voice of truth. And I'm totally intrigued what's going to happen to the film. How is he going to affect Anwar? How is Anwar going to respond to this? And it turns out, as he watches one of the most powerful reenactments in the film, he starts to recognize that indeed, as he says in the clip we just saw, this film could turn the history around 180 degrees. And he gets second thoughts because he recognizes that opens the floodgates to justice, potentially, and to losing power. And he says in that moment, we should stop. He warns people. Now in the clip, he does it in a kind of typically Indonesian way where he doesn't quite say, absolutely, you must stop, but that's what he's saying. And after this, and I was very disappointed with him, very angry with him because he'd been through this, he'd come in, I had a lot of hope for him. And then I heard him say through the radio mic after we shot this scene, don't you think Josh is a communist? To his friends. And that was one of the few moments in the film where I was genuinely frightened.
Scared.
I took a deep breath, I went over to him and I said, Adi, if you have a question for me, here I am. You can ask me. And we addressed it together. He leaves the film. The next thing that happened was, in fact, the drive in the car that we saw just before this, where I confront Adi because I was angry, because I was frustrated with him. I could say very directly, look, you've committed war crimes. Now, one of the interesting things here is that he's warning both the younger thugs who we see on the set around Anwar and Adi and Anwar not to continue, and yet they all decide to continue. And I think that's interesting too. Why don't they heed his very sensible warning? Well, I think there's two reasons for it. The younger thugs, they are members of this paramilitary group whose whole power is based on fear, being feared. And the chief source of that fear is their reputation from the genocide. They know that they don't. Their
power is that fear.
At least their short-term interest is not to look good, but to look bad. And so they want to continue. And Herman asks the question very directly, well, why should we always hide our past? Anwar continues, I think, because as we talked about much earlier in the show, Anwar's not trying to look good either. Anwar's trying to run away from his pain and deal with it. He's both being listened to for the first time in his life, really listened to.
Well, the statement also about going to The Hague and becoming famous, that is happening when you're making this movie. You know, they're living quietly with this nightmare. If they bring it to the world, not only might their power rise and the fear rise within the people remembering this, but also they get to be famous.
And of course, for gangsters, when you have a regime of killers who are in power, they don't understand, in fact, the difference between fame and notoriety. Being famous and being notorious is meaningless.
So I have to wrap it up because you have to be on a plane to go and tell other people these incredible stories. But I want to ask you two questions. Anwar, you mentioned that you're in touch with him regularly. How has his life changed now as a result of the film, day to day? People must be recognizing him. I don't know if there's that level of freedom for them to, you know how they say they whisper their resistance, they whisper their curses. Are they speaking louder now? Is he reporting that to you? And then you yourself, you mentioned that you were very affected by this. There's no way you couldn't be. There must have been times you became very angry, I would imagine, and sick. Tell me about that, if you would. I have to do two questions in one because I'm getting the wrap up thing.
Anwar has lost his swagger, and in Indonesia generally perpetrators no longer boast. You could no longer make the act of killing in Indonesia. It's no longer a repeatable experiment. That said, Anwar is okay. He's living, he's no longer also doing crime, to my knowledge. He's living a kind of in comfortable, relatively comfortable retirement. He and I, one of the reasons we're in touch quite frequently is because I've wanted to make sure he's not blamed by Pancasila Youth for making the film. He shouldn't be scapegoated for it by them. And luckily they have not, that's the paramilitary group in the film. They haven't blamed him, they've blamed me. And that's good, that's good. But he's all right. People do recognize him and they do speak openly to him. But he's...
Openly about...
yeah, okay. Although I think the film's, the human way in which I approach Anwar in the film and the way that the reporting on the film in Indonesia has said, this man is not the key killer in 1965, he's one of thousands. That has meant that survivors and the human rights community have by and large been concerned about him. The daughter of one of the very first genocide victims saw the film. She's one of the main advocates for the film, holding screenings and so forth. But after she wrote me her reaction to the film and wrote me saying how she wanted to show the film, she ended with, "How's Anwar?" And then she wrote me again 2 weeks later, "I was just thinking about Anwar, how is he?" And then one more time I got another email some weeks after that again, "How's Anwar?" So Anwar somehow, I think that the human...
Because he had the courage to explore this.
And
maybe.
Also
because he throws up and shows
we see that he's destroyed by what he's done. He's escaped justice, but he has not escaped punishment. And as for me, I think this film, it was a painful film to make. There were long periods of nightmares and insomnia. I got through it because of the wonderful support of my anonymous Indonesian team. There's an Indonesian co-director whom I would wish could be sitting with us on the show, but for his safety, he can't. And that's been sad for me. Above all, I think making this film has made me reluctant to condemn other people while never denying my condemnation of while always remembering my condemnation of individual acts. So to say, this is wrong, that is wrong, is something I do much more clearly now, while refusing to say this man is a monster. And I think it's also the only other thing I'd say is that it's in general made me recognize that denial has a price. That maintaining, we all tell stories to justify our actions. We all lie to ourselves to justify our actions. And I'm more vigilant now about not doing that. I really want to look honestly at what I am, what we are, what our society is, and reconcile myself to that rather than lie to myself about it.
I'm sure that you are very, very much on the road with this film right now, and probably not thinking towards the next one, but I can say personally I look forward to whatever comes next, and if I didn't have time pressure I would ask you what's next. But what we should do is leave off with a clip. Let's look at Anwar starting to come out about the fact that this really is affecting him. And this is interesting too in terms of denial and in terms of different cultures' approach to mental health and what it means to admit that you're vulnerable. Let's look at Crazy. Joshua, thank you so much for being on the show. Congratulations on making an incredible film, and thank you for making this film and bringing it to us. And thank you to Werner Herzog and Errol Morris for jumping on board and backing this in the way that they have. This has been another episode of BYOD. We'll see you next week. Thanks.
Buat saya bagaimana akhirnya sering dulu ada gangguan sama aku dia pada waktu tidur, karena mungkin ya waktu yang mengikat pakai kawat itu kan itu langsung awak lihat. Ya, itu kan langsung. Tapi kan banyak kejadian yang lain juga langsung. Iya, tapi kadang-kadang pada malam atau teringat mau tidur atau ini, itulah menjadi gangguan itu. Perasaan dihantui itu datang pertama dari mental yang tidak kuat, batin yang lemah. Kau pernah ke dokter saraf? Karena kalau saya pergi ke dokter saraf, saya pikir saya itu sudah